Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're taking a deep and carefully detailed look into the growing reports and discussions surrounding claims that the Russian army could become stranded in Crimea, a region that has played a central role in the conflict for years. The situation is layered, complex, and rapidly evolving, and in this video we're going to break down the possible reasons behind these claims. What evidence is being talked about, what remains unverified, and how such a scenario could affect the broader geopolitical landscape. This is a big topic, so let's walk through it step by step and examine what different experts, analysts, and observers believe could be happening behind the scenes. There has been an increasing amount of commentary suggesting that Russian forces in Crimea could face isolation due to sustained pressure on supply routes, infrastructure vulnerabilities, and continued Ukrainian strikes aimed at weakening logistical capabilities. While many of these discussions come from analysts examining open-source information, it's important to stress that the situation is fluid and that some details remain uncertain. Nonetheless, the narrative has gained attention because the military logistics surrounding Crimea have always been critical to Russia's operations. One of the core ideas behind the claim that Russian forces may be stranded comes from the importance of the Kerch Bridge, a massive structure linking Crimea to mainland Russia. This bridge acts as one of the primary routes for equipment, food, ammunition, and reinforcements. Over the past year, repeated attempts to strike or disrupt this bridge have highlighted how fragile a single supply artery can be during a prolonged conflict. If this bridge becomes unusable or unreliable, the Russian military could find itself facing serious bottlenecks. Another major route is the land corridor running through southern Ukraine, areas that have seen intense fighting, shifting control, and heavy damage. Analysts have noted that if any part of this corridor becomes contested or impassable, it further squeezes Russia's ability to maintain a stable supply flow into Crimea. Even small disruptions can create ripple effects, especially if they accumulate over weeks or months. Beyond logistics, there are reports discussing the growing pressure on Russian defensive positions inside Crimea. Ukrainian long-range strikes, whether with missiles, naval drones, or other systems, have increasingly targeted depots, command posts, radar systems, airbases, and ammunition storage sites. Each strike may not collapse an entire network, but combined over time, they can weaken defensive layers and force complicated adjustments. The more infrastructure is damaged, the harder it becomes to maintain regular operations. Another factor people are talking about is morale and exhaustion. Long deployments, harsh conditions, rotation difficulties, and continuous threats from precision strikes can slowly drain troop readiness. If movement becomes restricted and supply routes become unpredictable, morale issues could intensify. Analysts note that isolated forces often begin to struggle with coordination, flexibility, and response times. There's also increasing discussion about how the Black Sea Fleet has been pushed into a narrower operational space. Ukrainian attacks on naval vessels, ports, and headquarters have reportedly limited Russia's ability to freely move equipment by sea. While Russia still has naval capabilities, the constant threat environment has forced them to be more cautious. Stranded forces are not just about land supply, they're also about limited maritime options. Another layer worth considering is the geopolitical pressure as international sanctions, resource constraints, and political tensions continue. Russia has had to stretch its logistics across multiple fronts. Supporting Crimea at full strength becomes more complicated when the conflict demands high levels of ammunition, fuel, technology, and manpower across different areas. Analysts believe this strain contributes to the narrative about possible isolation. But it's also important to note that Russia has historically adapted under pressure. Even if their forces face disruptions, they often find workarounds, new routes, temporary bridges, ferries, or redeployment strategies. So, while discussions of being stranded are widespread, nothing is absolute, and situations can shift quickly depending on military decisions and political priorities. Another point raised by observers is the issue of ammunition. Modern warfare burns through enormous quantities of artillery shells, drone components, fuel, and spare parts. If Ukrainian strikes consistently hit stockpiles in Crimea, Russian forces could find themselves rationing supplies. That doesn't mean immediate collapse, but it does create friction in operations, especially when under active assault or preparing for counteroffensives. Winter conditions are another complicating factor. Harsh weather can affect both sides, but for a force already dealing with supply challenges, winter logistics become significantly harder. Frozen roads, damaged rail lines, and unpredictable storms can delay convoys, restrict vehicle mobility, and slow down repairs. If Russian forces in Crimea are already stretched, winter could magnify those weaknesses. Air superiority also plays a role in the stranded forces narrative. Ukrainian drones and missiles have increasingly reached deeper into Crimea. Even if these strikes don't destroy everything, the constant threat forces Russian command to reposition aircraft, missiles, and radar systems, often dispersing them or relocating them farther from the front. This disrupts coordination and reduces the ability to defend supply lines effectively. Meanwhile, Ukraine's use of long-range capabilities, some domestically produced and some supported by international partners, has expanded far beyond early expectations. These tools allow them to threaten Russian infrastructure in Crimea more frequently and more accurately, adding pressure over time. When infrastructure must constantly be repaired or reinforced, operational efficiency drops. There is also the human factor. Local populations, administrative structures, and civilian logistics all become stressed when military situations intensify. Electricity disruptions, shortages of goods, communication issues, and heightened security measures create a sense of instability. In such an environment, movement becomes slower and riskier, and the military has to invest more effort in maintaining order. Some analysts also suggest that Russia may be worried about evacuation challenges. If a large withdrawal ever became necessary, the available routes could bottleneck quickly. This fear adds weight to the idea that stranded forces would be in a particularly vulnerable strategic position. Evacuating tens of thousands of troops, equipment, vehicles, and supplies under fire is extremely difficult. This is why many observers believe Russia is heavily investing in defensive fortifications throughout Crimea. Satellite images show trenches, anti-tank lines, bunkers, and other defensive structures. These are clear signs that Russia is preparing for long-term resistance in case supply issues worsen or Ukrainian forces push closer. Fortifications are both a defensive measure and an indication of concern. To understand whether Russian forces may become stranded, we also need to consider the broader strategic goals of Ukraine. Crimea is symbolically and militarily significant. Regaining control would be a major victory, but the process would be extremely complex. Ukraine has gradually increased pressure on Crimea rather than rushing into a direct ground offensive. The strategy seems to be to slowly weaken Russia's logistics, command structure, and morale until maintaining control becomes too costly. From Russia's perspective, losing Crimea would be politically and militarily unacceptable. This means they will likely commit significant resources to prevent their forces from being isolated. However, If Ukraine continues to disrupt railways, bridges, and depots, the cost of holding Crimea may rise dramatically. One of the biggest challenges in analyzing the situation is the fog of war. Both sides have reasons to shape narratives in their favor. Ukraine wants to show progress. Russia wants to demonstrate control. This makes independent, verifiable information harder to obtain. Still, satellite imagery, expert analysis, and open-source intelligence help fill some gaps. Some reports suggest alternative supply routes are being expanded, including ferries and temporary bridges. These efforts indicate that Russia recognizes the vulnerability of its primary connections and is trying to reduce dependence on a single route. But ferries can only move limited amounts of supplies compared to a major bridge, and temporary structures are more fragile. If the Kerch Bridge becomes unreliable for long periods, Russian forces may have to rely heavily on land routes through occupied areas that remain under pressure. This could force them to commit additional troops to protect supply lines rather than reinforcing Crimea itself. Electrical and communication infrastructure is another concern. Repeated strikes or sabotage can degrade command and control abilities. If communication becomes inconsistent, coordinating defenses, requesting supplies, or mounting counterattacks becomes harder. A stranded force is not just one without food. It's one that struggles to communicate, coordinate, and adapt. Another aspect is air defense. Crimea has traditionally been one of the most heavily defended areas under Russian control. Yet, despite layers of radar, missiles, and interceptors, Ukrainian drones and missiles have repeatedly penetrated these defenses. Each successful strike shows weaknesses in the system, and each weakened system makes future strikes easier. There is also the possibility that Russia could choose to withdraw certain units proactively if conditions worsen. Such a move would be politically sensitive but militarily logical if commanders believe they cannot maintain their current numbers in Crimea without significant risk. A partial withdrawal could be an attempt to avoid a full-scale crisis. Ukrainian morale is also relevant. Successes in striking Al-U targets in Crimea energize their forces and supporters. A motivated military with clear objectives can maintain operational pressure for long periods, creating additional challenges for an already stressed opponent. The international context cannot be ignored. External support or lack thereof directly affects the capabilities of both sides. If Ukraine continues receiving advanced systems or expanded permissions for long-range strikes, its ability to target Crimea increases. If Russia acquires new partnerships or resources, it can reinforce its positions. The balance shifts constantly. Even in a scenario where Russian forces become partially isolated, they may still remain capable of holding defensive positions for a significant period. Isolation does not automatically lead to collapse, but it does create vulnerabilities that could compound under pressure. The idea of being stranded is more about long-term sustainability than immediate disaster. Crimea's geography itself presents unique challenges. Narrow land approaches, coastlines exposed to naval drones, and mountainous areas that restrict movement make logistics harder even without conflict. In wartime, these natural limitations become more significant. Supplying thousands of troops requires predictable, large-scale transport, not small, improvised routes. If Russian forces truly face isolation, one of the first visible indicators would be reduced activity levels. Fewer offensive movements, fewer rotations, fewer large convoys, and slower reinforcement patterns could suggest logistical strain. Observers have been watching these indicators closely to understand the overall picture. Another sign analysts look for is the frequency of emergency repair work on infrastructure. If Russia repeatedly rushes to repair the same bridges, rail lines, and power stations, it suggests Ukraine is successfully degrading key assets. Sustaining a large military presence under these conditions becomes harder with each strike. There's also the question of long-term planning. Some believe Russia may attempt to restructure its supply network to avoid over-reliance on vulnerable infrastructure. But such projects take time, resources, and stability, three things that are difficult to maintain in active conflict zones. For now, Crimea remains under Russian control, but the pressure is unmistakably increasing. Whether this will lead to forces actually being stranded depends on future strikes, defensive adjustments, international decisions, and the unpredictability of war. What is clear is that Crimea is entering one of its most tense phases since the conflict began. Many experts warn that the coming months could be decisive. If Ukrainian strikes intensify and supply routes grow weaker, Russia may have to make hard choices. Alternatively, if Russia stabilizes its logistics and fortifies key areas, they may maintain control for much longer. Each day adds a new piece to the puzzle. The narrative of stranded forces is not just speculation. It reflects the real challenges of maintaining a large military presence in a contested region with damaged infrastructure and constant pressure. Whether it becomes reality remains to be seen, but the signs are significant enough that analysts worldwide are watching closely. Whatever happens next, the situation in Crimea is likely to influence the broader trajectory of the conflict. Control of this region shapes naval power, supply lines, political messaging, and strategic options for both sides. That's why both armies are heavily invested in the outcome. As we continue monitoring developments, it's essential to approach every report with caution. Information can be incomplete or biased, and rapid changes can make yesterday's assumptions irrelevant today. Staying informed means understanding both possibilities and uncertainties. The story of whether Russian forces may become stranded in Crimea is still unfolding. It's a combination of logistics, military pressure, infrastructure damage, morale challenges, geographic constraints, and political stakes. Each factor interacts with the others in ways that make predictions extremely difficult. What we do know is that the pressure on Crimea is growing. Supply lines are under strain, infrastructure is being tested, defensive systems are being stretched, and both sides are preparing for the next phase, whatever it may be. Thank you for watching and staying with us through this detailed breakdown. If you want more deep dive explanations like this, make sure to stay connected and let me know what topic you want next. Stay informed, stay curious, and I'll see you in the next video.